My name is Seraphina Vale. Most people called me Sarah. For as long as I can remember, I tried to be the kind of person who never made anyone uncomfortable. The friend who listened, the girlfriend who forgave, the daughter who said it's okay when it wasn't. I was raised to believe gentleness was the same thing as strength. That notion almost killed me. I was 28 when I met Julian Mercer. He had a presence not loud, not showy, but an effortless gravity. He was the kind of man who arrived in a room and made the rest of the furniture fade. We met at a lecture about urban sustainability. I was working as a community coordinator, and he appeared to be a donor turned volunteer. He sat beside me and asked a question that wasn't only smart but somehow kind. How do you keep the city's edges from closing on people? I remember thinking, when he touched my hand briefly while we laughed afterward, that the world might have been kinder to me at last. He was patient in the correct way, not needy, not prideful. Over the next year, he became everything I imagined a partner could be. He introduced me to friends who became friends of mine. He sat through meetings that lasted longer than they should have and learned the names of our volunteers. He told me once, on a summer night with string lights and cheap wine, that he'd spent years wanting someone who wasn't trying to impress him. "You're not," he said. "You're who I could breathe with." I believed him. I gave him my trust in little increments and then whole cloth. When he suggested we merge our lives' apartments, bills, plans, I thought it was the safe thing to do. I was naive in the slow way of people who have always been told that kindness will outrun cruelty. The small erasures began softly. A misdirected invoice here, a meeting where he forgot to mention who had been invited, a story that didn't match in the same afternoon. I told myself explanations. People make mistakes, I told my sleep. He had demands at work. He forgot lunches. He was tired. I closed my eyes to the tiny discrepancies because love is a practice of willful blindness. Then a friend from university, Mia, texted me a photo. It was a screenshot of a bank transfer. My name, my organization, the amount. It was dated last month. My stomach fell into the space under my feet. I called the nonprofit's finance department. They did not recall authorizing the transfer. When I printed the ledger that night and held the paper in my hand, the letters looked like a confession. 2 weeks later, I came home early from a meeting. The apartment smelled different. Men's cologne that didn't belong to me, laughter that was too familiar. In the bedroom, under the dim light, Julian and a woman I had trusted, Madeline, a volunteer coordinator I'd mentored, were together, not furtive, not ashamed. For a second, I considered making the scene cinematic, a wild argument, a tearful exit, a public collapse. Instead, I put on a jacket, packed basic things, and left. I remember the cold of the night and the smallness of a suitcase. I remember a terrible silence that was not empty but full of 1,000 tiny treacheries that I had, until then, refused to read properly. I slept on a friend's couch and let sunlight trace the lines on my face until they were less sharp. What happens when your life, your money, your home, your reputation, has been quietly repurposed by someone you thought you could trust? You learn that betrayal is not logical. It's a slow rearrangement of trust into leverage. Julian had not only been intimate with people he should not have been intimate with, he had been quietly transferring funds from the programs I ran into accounts linked to his shell businesses. He'd arranged donors' money into matching investments that funded his ventures. He had used our shared life to mask an embezzlement scheme that I had unwittingly been the number on. For a while, grief occupied me like fog. But beneath that grief, like an ember fed by a breeze, I had not felt until then lived rage that sharpened into clarity. I started in the most boring possible way, paperwork. I made lists, requested bank statements under Freedom of Information protocols I'd never needed before, and documented every single deviation I could find. I slept with my head near my laptop, protecting files I saved in multiple locations. The ledger was the spine, the receipts and email timestamps were the ribs. People ask me now why I didn't immediately call the police or the news. Two reasons. The first is that I wanted certainty before I voiced anything that could be written off as emotional. The second was more personal and more strategic. Julian relied on reputation like a man relies on oxygen. He had built an image in the nonprofit world as a generous patron and sensible investor. I knew exposing the truth would require more than a phone call. It would require building a case so strong it would displace the stories he told about himself. So I learned to be patient. I learned, haltingly, how to make spreadsheets of other people's lies. I also learned something else. The small people who help us become whole are the first to doubt us when we speak, so I stopped telling anyone more than I needed to. I kept 3 confidants, my sister Leela, my oldest friend Marcus, and a lawyer named Priya, who used to be my mentor at a community law clinic. Each of them held the map as I drew it. There are nights I can still taste, the copper of panic and the sweetness of a plan forming. I would sit and read the timestamps on emails like constellations and trace the path of money across accounts. I found that Julian liked to write small code words in ledger notes, project match, reserve allocation, and reserve pending donor. Those notes mapped to payments that had left our organization and never returned as service or community support. He had stolen the fuel that ran our programs. I will admit something here that is not very heroic. It felt very much like treason. Not the dramatic betrayal of lovers in novels, but the small, pragmatic theft of someone rearranging the scaffolding of hope for profit. Every kindness he'd disguised as support was a trick. And when I understood that fully, I understood I had a choice: disappear with shame or become something cold and effective. I chose the latter. Here's the thing about revenge: it's most effective when it's boring. When it looks like ordinary law, abiding life, the person who's wronged can move and work and set traps while the other person continues to assume domination. I became boring in ways I'd never considered. I showed up at my day job unshaken. I smiled and graded reports. I signed receipts, and I ran community nights like a woman who had never felt deception. Julian, who'd expected me to become hysterical or to beg, kept doing what he did best: maintaining a veneer of competence. Behind that veneer, I made a different life. Priya and I filed for audit reviews. Marcus used his connections in finance to track transactions between Julian's companies and the nonprofit accounts. Leela kept close watch on his calendar. Sometimes a name on it matched a wire transfer 2 days prior. There are certain skills you get forced into learning: how to call banks and ask the awkward questions without betraying why you are calling, how to request bank account statements under the guise of standard bookkeeping, how to preserve a digital copy in a way that cannot be later dismissed as a forgery. I learned to speak the language of controllers and auditors. My grief was practicing arithmetic, my anger a newfound fluency in legal phrasing. We did small, intentional things. We had copies of donor contracts authenticated by third parties and compared them with the work that had actually been done. We photographed promised murals that had never been installed, lined up volunteers who testified they never received promised payments. We sat with people Julian had praised publicly and quietly asked them to look back through receipts. The trick is to make the trail unavoidable, not by noise but by redundancy, the same facts showing up in different places like a chorus. Meanwhile, Julian made 2 mistakes that would unravel him. The first was arrogance. He wrote off anyone who questioned him too easily and delegated accounting to men who were eager to keep secrets for handsome fees. The second was underestimation. He expected me to be crushed, to be slow, to be sentimental. He never factored in that a quiet, methodical woman with a ledger and a conscience could be worse than noise. She could be precision. The second month, our investigator Malik, a man with a tired humor and a passion for following money, found an account in the Cayman Islands tied through a chain of shell companies back to Julian's name. He'd moved modest donor disbursements through a labyrinth of accounts where, at the other end, a property was being purchased. A waterfront condo purchased under a company named Mercer Leisure Developments. The purchases were small enough to avoid immediate red flags, but frequent enough to drain the nonprofit's funds. I remember the day we printed a bank statement that had been sent to his office by mistake. The words swam like evidence on a page, and for the first time I allowed my hands to shake not with panic, but with the surge of setting everything in motion. That night I didn't sleep. I closed my eyes and rehearsed the narrative I would build, document, copy, verify, anonymize the tips, send. The curious thing about people who lie on a grand scale is that they still need an audience. They courted. Julian had assembled a small crowd of trustees and gala attendees who loved the story of his generosity. He could be forgiven for thinking the story was permanent. Stories are fragile, but stories built on checks and public praise have to be supported with receipts. When receipts vanish, the story begins to look like acting. We began small. An anonymous package of photocopied invoices landed on the desk of a local investigative reporter, Claire Nadir. Her eyes had the weary gleam of someone who knew how corrupt good intentions could be. She published an article that moved through the community like wind. It was careful, not sensational, but it had embedded documents. The headline did not say scandal. It said missing funds, and let people infer. Journalism opened doors. The charity board convened. They asked Julian for explanations in the polite way institutions ask for them. On a Tuesday, in a room with sandwiches. He presented charts, glossy slides, and a practiced apology. But when an auditor asked for bank transfers attached to specific project names and Julian's office could not produce them, the veneer cracked. There were tactical moves too. We secured sworn statements from volunteers who had emailed Julian about missing reimbursements and received no reply. We obtained internal memos where Julian suggested moving money to reserve accounts. Until matching funds were secured language, he used to justify moving funds between accounts without proper authorization. There were also human witnesses, an operations manager who remembered Julian approving a transfer while telling her they were tight on the community budget. As the board meetings multiplied and auditors requested further documentation, Julian began to panic. People he had once counted on began to withdraw. Partners at his firms stepped back. Invitations he'd once received were declined. He started making mistakes, sending an email to the wrong person, slipping into defensive language in a public reply. I'll be honest, watching the man peel away was not pure joy. It felt necessary, yes. It felt righteous, but it also felt, at times, like stepping over a precipice. I had devoted so much time to the work of dismantling him that I had to wonder, in the quietest 4 a.m. hours, who I would be after the ruin. I had to prepare not to be defined by revenge, but to be defined by what I rebuilt. In the end, the law did its slow work. Its reports found irregularities, donors demanded restitution, and Julian was asked to step down from his positions. Some legal threats were issued. The community, small and vindicating in its own peculiar way, shuddered with betrayal and then began to mend. That part of the work was done. But even as he lost his projects and his curated reputation, some things did not immediately change. He still tried to call me late, to manipulate my sense of inclusion, to beg for face, showing forgiveness. He preferred to ask me to meet for coffee. I met him once in a quiet cafe, and I realized he expected contrition to cost less than pride. He wanted me to absolve him. I did not. I gave him facts. I let him explain himself to the blankness of my small, steady face. He offered explanations that read like a man reading from rehearsed lines. I told him nothing. I let the sound of his own words hang until they had no purchase. He left the cafe shaken. A man who had assumed the world would always make allowances for him. In that moment I felt the first shadow of something I had not given myself permission to feel, an odd kind of relief. The ledger had been a terrible and necessary instrument. The work had been surgical. It had removed something that had been poisonous. But my greatest test was not his ruin. It was the silent, dull work of pulling myself back into the world, paying my taxes correctly, reconnecting with donors who had fled, tending to the people who still trusted me. The community needed me to be steady. I had to be steady. After the court hearings, the trustee resignations, and the press statements, the world around me quieted in a new way. There was no triumphant parade. Instead, there were emails of apology, lawyers' letters on both sides, and a feeling I can only describe as the unglamorous settling of dust. What I found surprising was how small the world felt at first, and how large I was suddenly allowed to be. Without the constant pressure of fear or the habit of accommodating someone else's lies, I had space to think. I began to fill that space deliberately. The first thing I did was a small, mundane act that felt revolutionary. I opened new bank accounts in my own name, with keys only I held. I sealed them like quiet chests. Then I rewired my life to include the kinds of things Julian had slowly taken away. Morning breakfasts with my sister Leela, galleries with friends who were honest and human, long walks with Marcus where we didn't discuss the ledger but talked about everything else. I wrote because the stories of others mattered, and because mine now had a voice. My first piece was not about Julian. It was about the quiet economies of care, how donors and small organizations are the sinew of neighborhoods, and how easy it is for that sinew to be cut by people looking for profit. I wrote to restore faith in the system and to caution those who trusted without verification. Then I turned outwards. I organized a tiny fellowship for community artists whose projects had once been funded by the very money Julian had redirected. We painted murals that required no sponsors. In a way, it was a symbolic return of what had been taken. The city's children painted with us, asking simple questions about color and not about money. The walls looked brighter, so did I. People sometimes ask if I ever forgave Julian. Forgiveness sits in a strange place for me. I do not rehearse malice, I do not wish harm, but I do not give pardon as a cheap token where it is not deserved. Forgiveness, if it exists for me in this story, is an act of letting the story go. It took years for the heat of the ledger to cool into something less like a weapon and more like a lesson. Slowly, life's rhythms returned. The morning coffee at a bakery that knew my name, the laughter of friends on a porch, a book I had always wanted to publish finding a small house that took it. I traveled to a place where the ocean met cliffs and felt a sky so big I could breathe differently. It was small things that added up. The sunlight on plants I had rescued, the certainty of my own name on a contract, the quiet pride of a job well done. Years later, at a community event where we unveiled a mural that used the ledger's story as inspiration for transparency and vigilance, a woman in the crowd approached me. Her hands were wrinkled and careful. "I read about your work," she said softly. "You gave us permission not to be blind." I wept then in the open air because the feeling poured through me like a kind of grace. There is the temptation when people ask me what I learned to offer aphorisms. I will give you two things that felt true, one practical, one spiritual. The practical lesson is this: guard your records, keep copies of everything. Don't assume that someone who loves you will always administer finances honestly. Don't confuse kindness with incompetence. Keep your own keys, ask for auditable receipts. The world needs people to practice diligent care. The spiritual lesson is you are your first home. When a person betrays you, they attempt to relocate a part of you into their ownership. Reclaiming yourself means you build walls and windows that allow light but not theft. It means learning how to love again without being naive about the capacity for others' cruelty. Sometimes, on long nights when the city hums, I open the old ledger in my drawer. It feels heavy, like a relic that was once sharp and is now only a memory. I do not reread to get angry. I reread to remember how far I have walked and who helped me carry the weight. My name is Seraphina Vale. I stopped whispering. I set out evidence like bread for birds, knowing truth attracts and feeds. I chose to practice patience over spectacle. I learned that the quiet, careful life can be ferocious when it needs to be. Most of all, I learned that the most important revenge is to live a life that cannot be purchased with stolen money, to make beauty from what was broken, and to teach others the craft of guarding the things they love that was and remains my victory. When the night finally answered, I did not bow to it. I built a window into it and let myself watch the dawn. The rest was mine.